Week on the Wheelhouse. Asian American and Pacific Islander studies in Connecticut schools. And a little later, police reform and endangered species. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. Yesterday, Connecticut officials finally reached an agreement on how to finance its long-awaited baby bonds program. The goal of the program is to reinvest money in underserved communities and help break cycles of generational poverty. It's important stuff. Our newsroom is following this development. According to Connecticut Public's Eddie Martinez, the state's baby bonds program is back on track to begin in July. And after months of political infighting among lawmakers, this thing's going to get done. Eddie was at a news conference where State Treasurer Eric Russell said this. He said, "It's sending a resounding message that your future can be bright regardless of what zip code you were born in and regardless of what family you are born into." We'll talk more about this on next week's show, but today we're checking in on a major bill from the last legislative session. Almost 1 year ago, Connecticut became one of the first states to mandate Asian American and Pacific Islander studies in K-12 public schools. The bill requires AAPI studies to be implemented in the state curriculum by the 2025-26 school year. It's also supposed to provide about $150,000 in state funding to support these efforts. School districts will incorporate a wide range of topics into their curricula, love that word curricula, from AAPI history to AAPI involvement in the arts. Where does the development of this curriculum stand right now? For more on that, we're joined by someone who's actually working on creating it. Jason Oliver Chang, the Associate Professor of History and Asian and American Studies at University of Connecticut, the Director of Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. Good morning, Jason.
Good morning, Frankie. Thank you for having me.
So excited to have you on. So excited to talk about the extensive work you're doing. This is going to be a lot for us to try to get into because it's very important work. And before we get into that, I just want to tell folks that they could join the conversation. 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. My first question for you, Jason. I want to go back to last year. A year ago, this happened. How did the AAPI studies bill first come to be, Jason?
Yeah, thank you, Frankie, for the question. The bill, came as a follow-up to from the previous legislative session, in which we were able to get a model curriculum, a K-8 model curriculum, and what was passed last session was a way of anchoring that in the statutes to say that following our colleagues and and other communities that brought African American, Latinx, and others, including Native American studies, LGBTQIA studies, into state statutes as required, and so that really helped to provide an anchor for the prior year's work. And so we're excited by this challenge, and really, thinking about the ways that the legislation really identified local contributions of Asian Americans, which I think is a really distinctive, piece to this kind of legislation that, we don't see that in other AAPI inclusion bills in other states. So really proud of the work that our legislative champions did here. And it's really lit the path for us.
Would you say this was a grassroots effort?
Yeah, absolutely. We came from parents, students, teachers, communities across the state have voiced their experiences of facing racism during during the pandemic. And for many, I think that experience was a kind of political education that their cultural and political invisibility has made them vulnerable. And so you know uh, it was it was surprising, frankly. I wasn't sure that we were going to be able to muster the kind of connections that we knew were needed in order to pass legislation. But in our first petition, we were shooting for about 50 signatures, and we ended up with hundreds in a matter of hours. And just online organizing and reaching out to different communities. So while we started a group called Make Us Visible, there were other groups, AAPI New Haven, AAPI Westport, numerous other groups around the state began to organize, and we couldn't have done it without them.
Why now? Why then, I guess, in 2022? Why were you able to make those connections and then turn it into really I know it was over across two sessions, but really quick in terms of how the law works into doing something important for the community?
Yeah, that's right. Really, it's 2023 now. 21st century education should be inclusive of everyone here. And so these are changes that when you talk to students about their invisibility in the curriculum, and you talk to parents who don't know how to bring the significance of their family's culture to bear on their students, on their children's lives without the help of schools is heartbreaking. And so when we think about where we want to see our schools, listening to students has always been an important way that education has moved forward. And this generation is just light years ahead of where I was, growing up. And so, they've really, shown us what, that they want to have a hand in their education, which they have every right to. So, I would say that the legislation is really, belongs to the high school students who spoke up in the last session. They were animated and by what happened in Atlanta with the shootings that happened in the various spas and massage parlors, where they saw what could happen when stereotypes um, and invisibility are the dominant norm. And so, these translate to everyday experiences for them. So, being able to voice their story and to give their lives context was an inspiring motivation. And as a historian, this is the calling of a lifetime.
One thing you've said that I want to echo here: can education reduce violence? Can you expand on that for us, please, especially on the heels of talking about those shootings in Atlanta?
Yeah, yeah. Oftentimes, I think when we see when we see these kinds of shootings, such as the ones that happened in Atlanta, as well as Fort Allen and elsewhere, even as close as the Mount Holyoke Mall earlier this spring. I think when these things happen, I'm reminded of what Andrew Feinstein, who's my colleague on the Connecticut Hate Crimes Advisory Council, said, if we have to take every one of these events personally. And what I took away from that is that if we only advocate for our individual groups, we're never going to have the kind of collective will to change what needs to be changed. And 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 so, part of, taking it personally is to understand the histories, and to understand the context. So there's a kind of, intervention model that, that education, has some promise for this, in the sense that, we can, build a deeper awareness of invisible communities and bring their stories into a context to demonstrate that they belong, that they are valuable in their own right. They don't have to prove their deservingness by their contributions. Humans are inherently valuable, and so, I believe in the power of education, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do at the university, is with working in clinical settings with my colleague Richard Zhang in the psychology department. And we have a clinical study where we had medical and dental students take a 1 week Asian American Studies course, and we measured the before and after effects of this education. And questions like, we surveyed them, and questions that actually changed as a result of their responses, that changed as a result of them having this lesson, this education, was that, questions like, there are some people I know I would never like, or I either get very angry or depressed if things go wrong. Like those were the kinds of questions that actually flipped for people. And so I think, if there's a way that the content of education, the curriculum, the way that it's taught, the pedagogy, can get in touch with people and give meaning to their lives, that these forms of violence will have a different, that will not occur. I mean, prevention is the name of the game here, and I think, inclusive education is one of the most promising, ways to achieve that.
Am I correct in understanding that this is not actually going to happen until, I think, 2025, 2026, the school year?
Well, that's when the mandate hits, but
Yes.
we've begun our work with schools now. I have a 3-year plan for how to move us towards that deadline. This first year, which we've just completed, is really organized around experiments, finding out what works, who are the important partners we need, what, we need to make some small mistakes first, and learn, from those interactions. And then the next phase is, curriculum building with this year, and and continued outreach with schools, which we're doing with like breakthrough magnet school south in the CREC system in Hartford. And then, that's going to lead us to a place where we'll have actual lessons and modules that we can do professional development, and that'll be the focus of year 3, so that when we arrive at the implementation date, hopefully we've brought up to speed numerous districts with hundreds of teachers, and that we enter into that space with, no surprises, and we just continue that work year after year.
A lot of work. You said in an interview with Education Week that passing the legislation was the easy part. Now you're on to the hard part, and you just gave us an idea of where the development of the curriculum kind of stands today. But now we got to ask you, what should it look like? And you talked earlier about local contributions from folks in the community, from different countries throughout the AAPI community. What can you tell us?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you, Frankie. It is really the hard work, and what we found is that, as we build connections with communities in the state, that it's opportunities for us to uncover more of the Asian American history of Connecticut. So, for instance, when we were working with the India Cultural Center in Greenwich, we started to dig into the historical record about Connecticut's first or early um, South Asian immigrants, and to use their historical experience as a way to educate middle school and high school students from the India Cultural Center what what their presence meant for Connecticut. That learning was the basis for them to go on and create um, to to conduct oral histories with their parents and grandparents. Those stories are now, you can hear those stories. They're amazing on Spotify, on a channel I created called My Story, Our Future. And these are the kinds of stories um, that we can expect to be used as ways of delving into contemporary Asian American history, right? To look at those the learning standards around social studies, would be fulfilled by stories such as these that help diverse communities to name their place and their historical significance. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that, not just that Asian Americans are here, but that their stories tell us really important things about economic change, about immigration, about global history. And so these are entry points into bigger conversations that really link to other ethnic and racial groups. So, this is something that I think is really important to underscore with
And
the AAPI curriculum.
And just really quickly, I want you to help me through this because you did this exercise before we started recording, and I'd really like to help us understand some of the folks that are living here in the state and this ethnic diversity that you talk about. Can you talk to me about some of these, and do this in a rather quick fashion, some of these communities that are represented here in Connecticut?
Yeah, so we use a number of indicators to really think about what the diversity of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are here in Connecticut. One could look at the languages spoken in schools that are reported by districts. You could look at the state reporting census figures on country of origin. And, these really show an interesting portrait of Asian America and Pacific Islanders communities here in Connecticut, with, the top sending countries being India, China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh, right? So there are a number of places, right, that where the face of Asian America in Connecticut looks different in different regions, right? So like in Hartford, we have a very significant Southeast Asian community here. And that's not going to be the same in Tolland County. And then, if we're looking at Pacific Islanders, we know that we have a large Chamorro community from Guam along the coast near New London and Bridgeport. And, there's, being sensitive to these kinds of differences, I think, is an important way to demonstrate awareness of Asian America.
888-720-WNPR, 888-720-9677. The call-in number if you'd like to join our conversation. One of the big differences between Connecticut's bill and some of the similar efforts you're seeing across the United States is that it also says that it's going to set aside funding for this. Where does that funding stand today, and are you finding that there's been support from the state, I guess, in the year since this has been passed?
Yeah, thank you. So we did receive an appropriations in the legislation for 100,000, I believe, in the bill. That passage was through the vehicle was SB1, which is the student mental health bill that was passed, a major landmark legislation. And that we have not seen the realization of those appropriated funds. So these are, that was supposed to go to a position in as a diversity curriculum writer and coordinator. And, we see this as a really important piece to to implementing this legislation, because we know that a standalone AAPI curriculum that is unconnected or just solely focused on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders will fail. That will be very challenging for schools and communities to connect with and to use in the school. And a diversity, a curriculum, coordinator is a really important role, because we know that a successful profile of the curriculum is going to be one that integrates other ethnic and racial groups. There's, our communities don't live in silos, and so it's important for the curriculum to reflect that. And so for instance, I've written a comic book about a Connecticut captain who left the shores of New Haven in the 1850s to transport indentured Asian workers to Peru, but they mutinied in the Pacific, and their case was strikingly similar to what happened at the Amistad in just 13 years earlier. So, there are connections between slavery and African Americans that we can bring in during the Civil War period that demonstrates how Asian American history has been a part of these core questions about the nation and about our history. And so, we think that a curriculum coordinator, would help to ensure that these histories, these studies remain linked.
I'm sorry to hear that funding hasn't come through yet. What's the state saying to you? Have you reached out to the state and asked them what the deal is?
Yeah, we've asked for the new job descriptions to be created, and for the position to be announced. And we've heard that the funding, it could not be located. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but we know that the final appropriations were approved and voted on.
And just really quickly, in the last two questions or so, I want to kind of get these through, because that was an important thing to talk about with you, the funding. How do you think we should be measuring the success of implementing curricula like this?
Yeah, there's a number of ways, I think we can approach this, but, on the one hand, I understand that, things that aren't tested aren't taught. But on the other, so I do appreciate that, that reality in schools. But at the same time, we have to realize that these kinds of lessons can't just be measured in terms of knowledge acquisition, but we can also see them in terms of, how people are treating each other. We can see this in the reduction of bullying. We can see this in contributions to a new kind of civic culture, a 21st century civic culture, in which we are literate in each other's struggles. And I think this is an important goalpost for our curriculum, because, as a historian, we say that every generation writes their own history. And I think, that this bill is, this work is providing the raw materials for the next generation to write their own history, hopefully one that is more inclusive and points to collective, progress.
Jason Oliver Chang, the director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute, thank you for your work on this curriculum, Jason, and thank you for coming on The Wheelhouse.
Oh, thank you, Frankie. This was a pleasure.
Thank you for coming on. And if you're listening, join the conversation, 888-720-9677. We're coming back next to talk about police reform in Connecticut. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Last year, New Haven resident Randy Cox was seriously hurt in police custody. He was riding in the back of a police transport van. The van didn't have seatbelts. On the way to the police department, the driver of the van stopped suddenly. And that's when Cox flew into a metal partition inside the van. He became paralyzed from the chest down. Now lawmakers in the House have passed a bill they hope will prevent something like this from happening again. For more on that, we're joined by my dear colleague in studio to my left, Eddie Martinez, a reporter at Connecticut Public. Good morning.
Good morning, Frankie. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. And if folks want to get in on the conversation, they can give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Big question kind of here for you, Eddie. Why now? What's inspiring lawmakers to take up the issue this session?
Well, really, aside from the obvious, the fact that this happened last year, a lot of it also boils down to grassroots activism that pressured lawmakers to take this up in the General Assembly this year.
Other situations in police custody where people were severely injured or killed while riding unsecured in a police video, or excuse me, in a police, I can't even speak today, in a police vehicle, something that this is invocative of, maybe even outside of Connecticut?
Yes. There's been several incidents, the most prominent being Freddie Gray in Baltimore in 2015. He died after suffering severe spinal cord injuries.
That's a big question I kind of posed to lawmakers kind of earlier this week in talking about this issue. Was you have a Freddie Gray situation where you don't have somebody properly buckled, and then there's something that's evocative of what happened to Eric Garner in the city, where Eric Garner's telling police officers he can't breathe, and you have a situation where Randy Cox is saying, I cracked my neck. And then, the police response, as we saw in a video, was not what it should have been, and you have somebody that's injured. How are lawmakers now trying to prevent what happened to Randy Cox from happening again, and what does this proposed legislation entail?
Yeah, so the legislation itself, the text of the bill states that there would be a set of guidelines set up to train police officers how to secure a suspect in the vehicle, mandating them to secure them with a seatbelt while they are in a police vehicle. And if there are consequences if they don't do that, if the bill passes, post the state's accreditation of the body for police, and they would take action and could possibly decertify a police officer if they do not follow through with that, if the bill passes.
It's incredible over the last couple of years in Connecticut how that's become a possibility where posts can now, it's always been something that they could do, but they've now been emboldened to do that through police reform legislation in 2021, and now this in possibly happening in 2023. Would it be up to the municipalities to implement? How do they kind of play a role in all of this?
Yeah, it would be up to the municipalities to actually implement this policy, but it would be any sort of a action that would take any consequences towards a police officer that would be on the post's purview.
From Eddie's reporting, the bill would have the state's Police Officer Standards and Training Council, POST, create a statewide policy mandating seatbelt usage for suspects. It would also require police training to ensure suspects are safely secured while in transit. And Eddie said a little bit of that earlier, but I just want to underscore it. What does support look like for this bill within the legislature?
The co-sponsors of the bill have told me that they feel pretty confident about it, especially because there were no nay votes while this bill was passed in the with the state representatives body. There were 140 yes votes, 11 abstentions, but there were no nay votes. And so far, from what I've heard, they feel pretty confident that this could get support in the state Senate.
Co-sponsors, you're talking about Ann Hughes, who's a Democrat in the House, and Craig Fishbein, who's a Republican in the House from Wallingford.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so you're seeing this bipartisan support, you think, for this bill?
Yes.
Anybody that has thoughts on this bill that's really in the name of Randy Cox, give us a call right now. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Just want to get to a comment from a friend here in Connecticut, Robin. I was arrested in 2004. I was put in handcuffs, and the police went on a joyride when I was in this vehicle, and I was tossed around, and it resulted in spleen damage. Really sorry to hear about that. And this is the bill. This kind of bill is trying to, Robin, solve for that kind of an issue and make sure that doesn't happen again. Very, very harrowing to hear a story like that. Also very harrowing to hear what happened to Randy Cox. The bill, is it seeing any opposition from outside the legislature?
Yeah, there has been some opposition, especially from the Connecticut Council of Police, AFL-CIO, which represents police officers throughout the state. They've issued public testimony saying that this bill doesn't take into account some of the more the day-to-day realities of policing, where they have to deal with violent and uncooperative suspects. So they said that it's very difficult to implement in practice, and they think that the punishment aspect of it is a little too severe.
A lot that lawmakers are dealing with here. It's comments from the public that they're not going far enough, and then comments from police saying, and obviously unions saying that they're going too far and putting some roadblocks ahead of officers. Speaking of officers, the ones charged in the Randy Cox case, what happened to them, and what's the latest on their futures?
So the New Haven, the New Haven Police Department and the New Haven Police Commission is still currently deciding whether or not to fire for the police officers that were involved in this case. They were supposed to decide the fate of a certain police officer, Jocelyn Lavendier, last month, I believe. That didn't happen. It was postponed. And as of now, there hasn't really been any update on what's going to happen with the other with the four officers.
A slap in the face. That's a comment I heard from Randy's sister, LaToya Boomer. She said this outside of New Haven City Hall in response to the misdemeanor charges the officers face in this case. It's another police reform proposal being considered by lawmakers right now in Connecticut. Senate Bill 1062. It requires medical attention for anyone requesting it while in the presence of a peace officer. It's supported by State Senator Gary Winfield and members of the State Judiciary Committee.
Why not say that this person seems to be in some form of medical distress, and maybe they are not being real, but let's err on the side of being cautious in case there's an issue we don't want to exacerbate it. And I think that's what we are saying with the legislation we put forward.
This bill that Gary Winfield's talking about was actually proposed prior to the Randy Cox incident, but it's a reason the bill needs to be passed is what he's pointing to. It's made it through the Senate, next up the State House. This bill, Eddie, really quickly, back to the seatbelt bill, what should we expect and when should we expect it to hit the governor's desk?
It really depends. I've heard from people who know that it's, even though there is broad support for this bill, it appears to be, they can't say for sure that this would they said that they felt confident, but at the same time they were kind of hedging their bets a little bit by saying that there still could be some chance that it may not make it, but they are very confident about it, and probably by the end of the session, probably in June.
Has to go to the Senate, then it could be into effect in July if signed into law, and then April of 2024, I guess, it looks like where this could actually be implemented. Thank you so much, Eddie Martinez, my colleague from Connecticut Public. Thank you so much for coming on the show this morning.
Thank you so much.
Join the conversation if you want to participate, 888-720-9677. Back with the Endangered Species Act next. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This year, 2023, marks 50 years since the landmark Endangered Species Act was enacted by Congress. Passed with strong bipartisan support, a rarity in Congress today, the Endangered Species Act did exactly what its name implies. It worked to protect species from extinction. Grizzly bears, humpback whales, bald eagles. These are just some of the dozens of species now listed as recovered under the law. Despite the passage of this law, there's still countless endangered and threatened species in the U.S. In Connecticut specifically here, we got piping plovers, bog turtles, and barn owls. They're among the species at risk. I just wanted to ask you, and so did my colleagues here that put this show together, what could the next 50 years of the Endangered Species Act look like? Here to walk us through that is William Busby, professor and faculty director of the Environmental Law and Policy Program at Georgetown University. Thank you so much for coming on this morning, Bill.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy to speak with you.
Oh, and I'm really excited to get into this conversation. 50 years of the Endangered Species Act. How did it come to be?
Well, the Endangered Species Act was passed in the early 1970s in a very different political time. Believe it or not, a major environmental law was passed with unanimous support in the Senate, avalanche of support in the House, and signed by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. And subsequent to that, it's been amended several times, but in ways that generally added flexibility, made sure it was based on sound science. And so it's from a very different time. Today, the environmental laws are highly divisive, but the early environmental laws were from a time when there was sort of a national consensus that protecting the environment, and especially endangered species, was something that was both ethically necessary, but also wise economically.
Can you provide some examples of why this is so important? Why this is so important to the country at large and I guess the environment, Earth?
Indeed. Well, I guess the first thing is that as people have found again and again, and people across the country have benefited from the genetic information in every species, including the ones that are on the verge of disappearing from Earth, has what Congress called an incalculable value. And so pharmaceutical companies have for many decades mined information in various species. And so endangered species are just incredible, valuable source of scientific information. But the second is that they're sort of the proverbial canary in the coal mine, to mix animal metaphors, but that if an endangered species or a species is endangered or threatened, that usually means that the habitat they're in is also under severe pressure. And there are other harms from that, including water quality, quality of life, humans' ability to enjoy outdoor space. And so very often endangered species and the recognition that they're there and in trouble leads to or catalyzes efforts to protect the habitat, which itself provides other benefits. So it's a sort of, and then I guess the last thing I should say is that there's certainly a strong undercurrent of just ethical and sometimes religious motivation behind it, that humans should simply not wipe off the earth through their actions, a species that's been there for millions of years. And so for that reason, you kind of combine these things: economic self-interest, interest in protecting nature and green spaces and functioning biodiversity, and then the ethical and sometimes religious motivation ends up being a fairly powerful set of reasons and why this has been a strong bipartisan supported law for many years, although under attack all the time in recent decades.
Canary in the coal mine, bird in the hand. We love animal metaphors, and if you do as well, give us a call, 888-720-9677. Maybe you have one for us, but also do give Bill Busby here an opportunity to answer some of your questions, 888-720-9677. Plants, animals, and their habitats. How does the Endangered Species Act and actually work in practice? How do these species become protected? Any loopholes in the law, Bill?
Well, there's a lot there, but and I welcome everyone to come in and take my class. It'll be a semester, but so the basic structure is actually pretty simple. So the first thing is if a government agency is doing something, or humans, just non-governmental actors, are proposing to undertake some action, and there's investigation. It shows there's an endangered or threatened species that may be there. The first thing is simply an investigation. Is there such a species there? Is it endangered or threatened? And if so, it's listed. And so that goes through a whole rulemaking process. So if it's listed, like the right whale off of Connecticut and the New England coast, then then all the protections of the ESA kick in. And then the government has to avoid jeopardizing endangered species through its own actions. And that means both the government's own, say, infrastructure actions or approval of private actions. And then there's another thing called the anti-take provision, which affects everyone, which is nobody can intentionally or through sloppy action take an endangered species, which means to chase, harm, or kill, and other similar words, or destroy their habitat that's needed for their thriving. And so that's the basic structure: listing, then these protections against harm or jeopardizing of their habitat and their existence, or taking, that is harming or killing or chasing of endangered species. But that simple three-part structure, as you can imagine, it leads to collisions between real property interests and environmental interests, sometimes fishing interests, and interests in protecting a species. Big agriculture is frequently unhappy about some of the protections of the Endangered Species Act in the Northwest. Timbering, resource extraction has from time to time caused collisions. And so you kind of put it all together. The most important, desperate efforts to protect endangered species really do affect people and businesses sometimes in their day-to-day activities, and certainly in their sometimes money-making activities.
Just writing big ag down and filing that under big authority figures that I need to worry about, Bill. But you talked about the administration and how they may see this. This administration sees the ESA much differently than the last one did. Tell me about the efforts of the Trump administration to weaken parts of the Endangered Species Act and what happened.
Well, that's a longer story to track the full Trump administration, but I'll generally describe it in some of the areas. So there's been in recent decades a pretty basic divide with Republican administrations, but especially President Trump, trying to weaken protections for the environment and, some cases, the Endangered Species Act, and then Democratic administrations that tend to be more protective, but sometimes also really will do as much as they can to protect powerful interest groups. And so it's not wholly one party versus the other. But the bottom line is the Trump administration in several ways tried to weaken protections and sort of grease the skids for business interests and the rest to go ahead and do things with especially less obligations to mitigate or offset harms to endangered species. And just yesterday, actually, the Biden administration announced some efforts to restore protections in the way of kind of mitigation and offsetting protections of important habitat where they are threatened from some kind of private or governmental action. And that was kind of restoring the law from where there had been some weakening under President Trump. To simplify one thing, that how the two administrations and also earlier the Obama administration approach science and the Endangered Species Act has been very different. That the Trump administration, not just in endangered species, but a number of areas, really didn't look carefully or looked away from data about risks to the environment, risks to health, and sort of bent over backwards to allow business interests to proceed even where the harms would be major. That attitude is not present in the current administration.
Well, the Secretary of the State was a former oil executive, right? With Rex Tillerson, right? That kind of doesn't track with protecting the environment, I guess.
Yeah, so there are certainly differences in attitudes and experiences. But actually one of the interesting things is I can't speak to Rex Tillerson, but historically, some of the strongest conservationists in the United States were sort of what used to be called in the Northeast Rockefeller Republicans, or in Connecticut history, there was Senator Goodell and other people, I guess Ribicoff, but that is senators who were kind of liberal Republicans who thought protection of the environment and endangered species was just an absolute necessity. And that included the two Bush administrations. They did not embrace efforts to destroy the Endangered Species Act. And so, I guess one thing we can hope for is a return to bipartisan support for endangered species protection. But I'm not so sure we should hold our breath that will happen.
Despite the Endangered Species Act, we've still seen species become extinct, right? What else we got to see, and what should be done from a legal perspective, I guess, over the next 50 years to address the crisis?
Well, one of the part of it is just eternal vigilance, that is, and this includes citizen groups. There's a lot of environmental efforts absolutely depend on citizen awareness of environmental not-for-profits. There are groups like Center for Biological Diversity or the Natural Resources Defense Council. There have been organizations in Connecticut, Protecting Long Island Sound, who really are the eyes and ears and watch what's happening. So they very often have been the force pushing the government to do what needs to be done. So that's the first thing, is you need active citizenry and eyes. And then the government has to do its job, that this is difficult, science-intensive work, and agencies need good scientists, they need the money to do the work, and they need effective leadership. But one other interesting twist we haven't talked about is the Endangered Species Act, going back to actually the Clinton administration and then some earlier statutory amendments, added a bunch of safety valve and kind of flexibility provisions that allowed people to come up with what are called habitat conservation plans. And so basically the law now rewards private actors and others who set aside habitat to protect endangered species, and then they can often go ahead and do what they want to do. And so it's really a win-win situation, it's kind of trading off and mitigation flexibility, but also with the deal being protect habitat, and then you can protect the species. I think we're going to continue seeing a lot of that. That has bipartisan support, and that's been a mostly very good thing, as long as the habitat protected actually matters and it is actually protected. That is, sometimes people offer up meaningless habitat protections, but if it's real protections and it's durable protections, that can be incredibly important. And I think we're going to see more and more of that across the country.
Bill, we had you on the hot seat today. We had you in the lion's den, so to speak, as we drop a metaphor here, an animal metaphor, to end the show. Big thanks to William Busby, Georgetown University. Great conversation we had about the Endangered Species Act. Thank you for coming on, Bill.
Well, thank you very much, and keep up doing the great work. Stay well.
You as well. Today's show produced by Meg Dalton. She did a terrific job with this episode. Jam-packed episode. Technical producer, Kat Pastor. Thank you to Tess Terrible for helping us in studio today. You can download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.